If you had $1,000 or $100 million to invest, the most important decision you're going to make is not whether you're going to invest in Apple or buy this piece of real estate. It's your philosophy of investing. You need to focus on finding a way to do more for others than anybody else in whatever industry you're in. You'll build a brand and you'll become dominant and you'll have a blast because you're a giver, Tony. You're not a taker. You're going to be proud of what you're doing, not just make a lot of money. Really knowing your market, really knowing your ideal customer, coming up with products and services that produce raving fans, coming up with an irresistible offer, which is a lot of what they do each time, an offer that is so good that people say, I got to at least try it. And then they over-deliver.
This is RichNation WBPT podcast, the #1 podcast in the world. We introduce you to the people and ideas, and we bring people together. Today we are here with the legend Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins is an entrepreneur, #1 New York Times best-selling author, philanthropist, and the nation's one life and business strategist. He has empowered more than 50 million people from 100 countries around the world through his audio programs, educational videos, and live seminars. For more than 4.5 decades, millions of people have enjoyed the warmth, humor, and transformational power of Tony's business and personal development events. Tony Robbins is the author of 6 international bestsellers, including the 2014 New York Times financial bestseller, Money, Master the Game, and Unshakable, Your Financial Freedom Playbook, 2017. His most recent book, Life Force, How New Breakthroughs in Precision Medicine Can Transform the Quality of Your Life and Those You Love. Tony is involved in more than 100 privately held businesses, with combined sales exceeding $7 billion a year. He has been honored by Accenture as one of the top 50 business intellectuals in the world, by Harvard Business Press as one of the top 200 business gurus, and by American Express as one of the top 6 business leaders in the world. Fortune magazine's cover article named him the CEO Whisperer, and he has been named in the top 50 of Worth magazine's 100 most powerful people in global finance for 3 consecutive years. Tony is a leader called upon by leaders. He has worked with 4 U.S. presidents, top entertainers, from Aerosmith to Green Day, Usher, and Pitbull, and athletes and sports teams, including tennis great Serena Williams, UFC champion Conor McGregor, and the NBA's Golden State Warriors. Business leaders and financial moguls from Salesforce.com, founder Mark Benioff to Ray Dalio of Bridgewater Associates have tapped him for personal coaching. Through the Tony Robbins Foundation, he has also awarded over 2,000 grants and other resources to health and human services organizations, implemented a life-changing curriculum in over 1,700 correctional facilities, and gathered thousands of young leaders from around the world with its youth programs. Please help me welcome Tony Robbins. I hope you guys enjoy the wisdom and pursue your dreams. Enjoy.
I don't believe in just doing New Year's resolutions because they don't work, obviously. When people call it New Year's resolution, 91% of the people don't follow through. That's the statistic. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's probably pretty accurate. And I think it's because they express what they want, but they don't really have a path or a plan or a strategy. And so it doesn't last. And so I think it's really critical that you don't just come up with something you want to do that you have some idea of. It's like, I always tell people, if you want to make progress in anything, you got to get on the path. Well, how do you know if you're on the path? Well, whether it's your finances, whether it's your business, whether it's your relationship, whether it's your body, the first thing is, do you know exactly what you really want? And you know why you want it with enough reasons, strong enough reasons to get you through. If you're not clear what you want, most people are clear what they don't want. I don't want to live this way. I don't want to be this way. Focus goes where, energy flows. I mean, the energy is going to flow where you focus. So the whole focus is, what do you want with precision? And then getting those strong enough reasons. And then the second step for people, and that I look at is, okay, all right, if this is what I really want, I got strong enough reasons, what's kept me from that in the past? And you got to see where the gap is between where you are and where you want to be if you're going to close it. So you got to be clear. And when I do that, I found there's really only 5 things that create that gap. The first one that gets in the way is fear for almost anybody. Fear of failure, fear of success, fear of not looking at some fear. But then the second one might be limiting beliefs. Like, I've tried everything. Well, that's what you say to yourself. That's what I used to say to myself when I couldn't lose weight. I hadn't tried everything. I tried everything, I would have been fit. And I eventually tried lots of things and got fit and stayed fit, right? Or, all the good ones are gone, right? In a relationship. So those beliefs can keep you from making progress. And unless you change those, setting a new goal doesn't mean anything. The third thing that can get in the way is some other emotion like overwhelm or stress or sadness or depression or feeling sorry for yourself or any other emotion that slows the accelerators of your life. And then the fourth thing that can get in the way for people very often is habits. So you say you want to lose 20 pounds, and the first thing you do in the morning is go to Starbucks and have a smoke, mocha, whatever. It's not going to happen. You got the wrong habits, right? It's one thing to have, resolve you want something, but that resolution isn't real if you don't have rituals to back it up. And so you got to come up with what those habits are. Or the last thing you might be missing is you just might be missing the skill. Like, finance, most people don't know how to get asymmetrical risk reward. They don't even know what it is. But every billionaire knows, right? That's how they became a billionaire, the ones that started with nothing. They don't take giant, insane risks. They figure what's the minimum risk or the most amount of upside that I can possibly get. And they do that over and over again, and you're going to eventually win. So if you don't know certain skills in a relationship, certain skills in how to run your business, certain skills in how to make your body go, then you're probably not going to make the progress. And then once you know that, then you come up with your massive action plan, and you don't wait till it's perfect. You take action, and then you go slay your dragons. You do the hard work. You change the belief. You change the pieces. You get some daily practices. You keep measuring and improving, and you'll get to where you really want to go, and then you'll come up with the next journey. It's like life is a journey. It's like the hero's journey. So I look at it that way. I look at it as saying, I got to get clear what I want now at this level, and what the increases are, and then what's gotten in the way, and then what am I going to do? Let me go get what's in the way out of the way, and then let me create some daily practices that virtually guarantee it. I learned so many things by interviewing 50 of the greatest investors in the world at that time. That's why I did it. I thought I knew a lot. I certainly did. I've worked with Paul Tudor Jones, one of the top 10 traders for 24 years. He hadn't lost money during that time, so I learned a lot from him. But I want to learn from everybody. And I learned 4 things fundamentally. I learned don't lose money as their first focus, which that's not most people's, because they know, if you talk to Warren Buffett, his rule is rule number 1, don't lose money. Rule number 2, see rule number 1, right? Well, that's ridiculous. Yeah. Of course you're going to lose money, but their focus is not to lose money, because if you're only trying to make money and you don't look at the downside, you're going to get hurt. And if you have a stock that drops 50%, you don't need 50% to get even. You got to get 100% return to get even. Right? So the way they do that is the second principle. No matter whether they're a macro trader or they were a value investor, it didn't matter. They all look at the way to protect themselves as having the right asset allocation. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book. Because asset allocation is big words for some people, but all it means is if you had $1,000 or $100 million to invest, the most important decision you're going to make is not whether you're going to invest in Apple or buy this piece of real estate. It's your philosophy of investing. And you think of it as 2 buckets, primarily. A bucket that's a security bucket where you're going to take some percentage of your money, you're going to decide in advance. It's always that percentage. 20%, 30, 40, 50, 70, whatever it is going to go in a place where it's low risk and less return, so it's going to take longer to get there. But because it's low risk, you're going to get there. It's like the turtle versus the hare type race. Then how much are you going to put that's in a risk bucket? Now, on the risk bucket, you have the potential for huge upside, but you also have the potential for big downside. And so what is that? Is that 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, 30-70? And, explain to people how to do that. But what I found out over the years, and now there's plenty of reports to back it up, is that the ultra wealthy have over 46% on average of their money in private equity, private real estate, and private credit. That is very different than 90% of the population that has less than 5% of that in there. Most people, they go and they put their money in stocks and bonds in their home and maybe a REIT. Those are the types of things where most people are moving them around. Now, why does that matter? Well, diversification was the 4th principle that we all know. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. But when I interviewed Ray Dalio, the most successful hedge fund guy in the history of the world, he's now managing almost $195 billion, to give you an idea. He manages sovereign funds, pension funds. Brilliant guy. In 2008, when things dropped, 34%, if I remember right, he was up 8%, to give you an idea. I mean, just genius. He warned everybody about it. So I asked him when I first met him 12, 13 years ago, and we were just becoming friends, I said, of all the things we've talked about, is there one principle above anything else that's the most important principle to becoming financially successful as an investor? And he said, Tony, I wrestled that for 12 years, and I can tell you what I call the holy grail of investing. That's where the title comes from. It's not from me, it's from him. And I said, what is it? He said, think about it, Tony. Once you know the fundamentals that you know, and asymmetrical risk reward was one of those as well, right? So once you know those principles, you got a great opportunity. But people want to get to their goals, and they want to get there faster, and most people are behind. So the only way to get there faster is get higher returns or put more money in, which a lot of people don't have. Or you take higher returns, you just got to take bigger risks.
risk.
And then you can lose everything, and now it defeats itself, plus all the stress involved. He said, so I figured out a mathematical principle. If this is his principle, Holy Grail. If you can find 8 to 12 uncorrelated investments, now correlated so your audience knows, or uncorrelated, a simple example, stocks and bonds. When the economy's going great, most people put their money in stocks because companies are growing, you get a bigger return. When things are in trouble, they're counting on their bonds to balance them out because they're supposedly non-correlated. Except when we have these big crashes, they all drop, and your broker goes, I don't know, it's not supposed to do that, right? And what I learned from Ray is that happens all the time. And he explained why, which we won't take the time to do right now. But here's what he said. If you can find 8 to 12 uncorrelated investments, you reduce your risk 80%, Tony, and increase your upside. I'm like, are you serious? And he showed me how it works in the math. It's all detailed. So then I went to go to work. How do I find 8 to 12 things that aren't tied together in some way? And the world is tied together so much in the public markets. And so then I started looking at private assets, and it's like, wait a second. Here's a nice statistic for your audience. In the last 35 years, every year, public stock markets have produced a lower return than average, not the best. I interviewed 13 of the very best, the biggest in the world in private equity and private credit. But the average has outstripped every stock market in the world in terms of profit. So I'll give you an example. Most people are familiar with the S&P 500 index, top 500 companies. Well, if you go through the S&P index and you say, how's it done over the last 35 years? It's produced an average return compounded at 9.2%. So that's pretty nice. If you're getting 5%, it takes you 14 years to double your money. 9%, you're doing it in 8 years. But average, not great, average private equity did 14.2% at the same time. So you were getting 50% greater returns every year, compounded year after year. So you know what that means. If you put $1 million away 35 years ago and put it in the S&P 500 and forgot about it without doing anything, it's worth $26 million today. But if you took the same $1 million and put it in private equity, average private equity, it's worth $139 million today, 500% more. So it became a no-brainer to say you can't put everything in private equity. You still need public markets, but maybe we should model the asset allocation of the smartest people on earth. So then I went to go work on that. And Dan, you know, because you've done well in your life, there's only a few players that are the best in the world. And then there's a second problem, which is, okay, for me, first it was just access. I know a lot of people, I've got a good brand, I've helped a lot of people, so I got access to some, but it's kind of like trying to get access to the new SP3, 3 Ferrari that's $4 million. Even if you have the money, you can't get it because it's only sold to the guys that already bought before. And that's what happens here. All the pension funds, so I would get little slivers. And one day I was talking to a good friend of mine who was one of Paul Tudor Jones's partners who started his own firm, really successful guy. I was talking about my frustration that I've gotten a few of these, but, too small to have a real impact. And he said, Tony, he goes, you've been a good friend to me. You've helped me in so many ways. I'm going to help you. I'm going to tell you where I put most of my money. I said, most of your money? He said, yeah. He goes, there's this place in Houston. I said, Houston? I thought he was going to say Singapore, London, New York, Connecticut. He goes, this group, they're one of the best in the world, and they've found a way where you don't have to get in the fund. See, when you invest in a fund, you're called a limited partner. When you're an owner, you're called a general partner, right? Just for your audience's clarifications. And he goes, you can buy a piece of the general partnership, a slice, and own the business. Now, these guys, these are the masters of the universe financially. Who are the wealthiest people in the world? What industry are they in? When I ask most people, they think tech, completely wrong. Then they think real estate, wrong. It's financial services, but it's not hedge funds because they go up and down. These guys in private equity have a really unique approach. There used to be 8,000 companies in the stock markets. There's only 3,700 now. And in the S&P 500, 5 of the companies produce 25% of all 500. It's so concentrated. But most companies in the world are privately held. And these private equity firms come in and they don't just try to buy at the right time. They buy a company or a piece of it, but then they add value. They change the marketing. They bring in new tech. They bring in a new CEO, and they grow the company, and then they sell it for a multiple to a bigger company, or they take it public. They tie up your money for 5 years. Why would people do that? Well, because the kinds of returns they get are so much better. People say, I'm happy to have some of my money be tied up for that kind of return. For them, that means they don't have to worry about the markets going up and down. So when it goes down, they can buy. When it goes up, they can sell. That's why they get such unbelievable returns, and they're adding value. They're not just trying to find the right thing at the right price. So I was blown away seeing those results, and I was like, okay, how do I do this? And what I found out is, they get their 2 and 20. For those unfamiliar, when you give them your money, they get 2% per year. That's what they charge on your money, whether they make money or not.
Fees, yeah.
And they get 20% of the upside. Well, people are willing to do it because it's not uncommon for a firm to go from $1 billion to $2 billion in 5 years. They make $100 million in fees over those 5 years. They make $200 million, the 20% of the next billion. They make $300 million on a $1 billion investment. That's why they're there. And most of them, the ones I interviewed, are 35, 50, $100 billion firms. So you get the idea of how they are. And they've all done 20% or more compounded for decades. One guy in the group has done 36% compounded for 26 years. I mean, it's crazy. So then I thought, okay, well, I can help my friends, wealthy friends. But then the reason I wrote the book, the final answer to your question, is because I had all these principles of the distinction. I own 65 of the biggest companies in the world. I'm getting the 2 and 20 right beside the owners, and I got their business when there's no inflation, their business with inflation, their future. I got private credit firms. So I was like, I'm out of my mind. And then I saw that Congress finally did something. It always bugged me. I always complained that, look, the richest people in the world get access to the best investments. People who need to grow it don't get access. Because the law says you have to be an accredited investor or even higher in some of these firms. And that means you have to have $1 million net worth already, not counting your house, or $200,000 in annual income, right? So Congress saw what I believe was true. I didn't have nothing to do with it, but they just passed across the Congress, and now the Senate's taking it up. It should get passed hopefully in the next 2 or 3 months because it's bipartisan, and the first one already passed. And they said, look, you shouldn't have to have a certain amount of money to do this. You should just know what you're doing. Some people build a business or they inherit money and they get to do it. They're not sophisticated. You take a test, you study and take the test, and then you can have access to these same components. So now the world can have access to this. So that's why I decided to bring this out at this time. But if you can imagine being able to have all that income, like you would get from, let's say, bonds, at the same time, like the income's between 8 and 10% on most of these firms each year, just on the fees, that's guaranteed. So when I invest in the firm, 80% of my investment is already guaranteed just by the income coming back from the guaranteed fees, and then I get the upside of the 20%. And we had one firm that was doing, I think we started them when they were doing 3.8 billion or something like that, and now they're at 22. It doesn't take a lot more employees to do that, by the way. The profitability of that firm is through the roof. And by the way, if that firm gets sold to a bigger firm, I'll get the multiple on that business when it gets sold. So it's pretty amazing. And so I walk people through all these different avenues so you can do something that's not correlated, so you can have 80% less risk and have more upside. Owning these companies where you get to be a partner with the smartest people in the world, that's pretty hard to beat. When everyone else is taking these giant risks at 3.9%, I was getting 9% on private credit. Private credit is just, since 2008, the banks have tightened up. Most people know about what happened recently, for example, Silicon Valley and so forth, banks. So what happens is most banks are not loaning to the majority of companies that need it. So they go to these private equity people. They really know how to vet companies, and they loan to the same companies over and over. They provide that capacity. Now, the beautiful thing about private credit is they have a 1% failure rate. Banks would die for that kind of return because these guys know what they're doing and they stay with the very best people. So incredibly safe, 3 times the return as if you did junk bonds at that time. But now the interest rates have risen. Now, by the way, I own those firms too, so I have 2 and 20 on those as well, not just the investment. But what's been amazing is if you bought a mortgage and it was at 3% and it was fixed, you're happy right now. You don't care that interest rates went up, because even 7% doesn't affect you. But if you had a floating rate, you might be paying 3 times as much as you were a few years ago. Well, in business, those are always floating rates. So we loan money to people in these firms, let's say at 5 and 6% originally, and now the rate has risen. Now they're paying us 12 and 13. Now, get a sense of what the profitability is on that. It's the same loan with the same people with no additional expense, and our profitability is through the roof, and I got the 2 and 20 on that as well. So I love that. But the one that's most fun is sports, because I'm a sports guy. I wanted to be a professional baseball player. One of my forefathers was a semi-pro baseball player, but I started late. I wasn't that skilled, and I got clear that wasn't going to happen by the time I got to high school. So I started looking at a different path. But the bottom line is, I was like, someday I really want to own a piece of sports team. It seemed like such a huge thing. Well, about a little less than a decade ago, I finally had enough money and enough, resources and some good partnerships, and I invested in the LAFC football club. We created the club, we built the stadium with my partner Peter Gruber and a group of other partners, and it was fun, and I enjoyed it. And then I moved to Florida, so I'm nowhere near there, but I still enjoyed owning a sports team. Well, I wanted to own more, and then, as you said, I bought a few others. But then, in the last 3 years, there's been a new rule change. And other than the NFL, all the other sports leagues now have a way. Only a few firms can do it because you can't use leverage. There's a bunch of rules around it. But where you can buy a piece of more than one sports team. So now I own, not only do I own the Warriors and the Dodgers, but I own the Red Sox and the Sacramento Kings, I own the Pittsburgh Penguins in hockey. It's amazing what you get to have a piece of. And to give you an idea, like Michael Jordan bought his Charlotte team, the NBA team, for $275 million about 12 and a half years ago. A group of people, including us, bought that interest for $3 billion. $3 billion, that's his return on 12 years. Another example is just the average. These investments are no longer just butts and seats. And by the way, it's not correlated to the stock market. That's the power. So when inflation hits, they just raise the price of a hot dog and people pay it. But it's no longer just butts and seats. It's also media. So when Peter Gruber and his partners originally bought the Dodgers, and they paid $2 billion for them. The most any sports team had ever gone for was $800 million baseball team. And people thought they were worth $1 billion. They were an amazing franchise. But $2 billion? So I went to Peter because I'm going to be part of this. I'm like, Peter, I know you're no idiot. You're one of the smartest people alive. How are you doing this? How are you going to pay $2 billion? And he said, Tony, you know me. I'm a movie producer. He said, you got to have a cliffhanger. He said, I'm going to announce it on Tuesday. Once you hear it, come to the house. We'll have a little party together and we'll laugh. They announced it on Tuesday. He sold the local TV rights for $7 billion and made $5 billion net immediately. Wow. And when you own a sports team, you keep your local rights, but you also get an equal share of everybody else around the nation. So whether you're a small team or a big team, you get your percentage of that. And they own real estate. So the average return in the last 10 years across Major League Baseball, the NBA, Major League Soccer, and hockey, if you took those four and merged them, the average return is 18% compounded per year. It's been 11% for the S&P 500, and it's not correlated. So it's an amazing opportunity. It does really well, and you have a legal monopoly. No one else can compete with you in that city, in that sport. You own it. So it's and your customers are literally fanatics. That's where the word fan comes from, fanatics, multi-generational. So it's an amazing business, and it's fun, and it's enjoyable. And people can be involved with it now like they never could before. I learned so many things, and they're in the book, but I looked also for common patterns, because then you see universal principles that work. And by the way, Sachs's genius, original PayPal mafia, he's an unbelievable guy, and I love him personally. But he, I think Robert Smith would take offense to he's the owner of SAS, because Robert is the owner of SAS. Robert's got $100 billion firm, and I can't say what his returns are because you got to get the prospectus to do it legally, but just he's the highest return of anybody that I interviewed for the longest period of time. It's mind-boggling what he has done, and he started with absolutely nothing. What I found really most interesting was the way they think about business and entrepreneurship. When I interviewed the 50 smartest investors in the world, traditional investors, Ray Dalio, Carl Icahn, Warren Buffett, Paul Tudor Jones, they all have different ways of doing things, but they're trying to buy something at the right price, right, and the right time. What's so cool about private equity is the best people, they're not buying just trying to get, they like to get a great price, but their entire focus is adding value. And what I mean by that is when I first met Jim Rohn, my original teacher, he answered one of the most important questions I had burning in my life, and it changed my life. I had 4 different fathers. We were always broke. The reason I provide 100 million meals a year, I've done 1 billion meals in the last 8 years, is because someone provided food for my family when we had nothing when I was 11. I never forgot it. Started with 2 families, 4, and built up. Well, if you look at somebody like what Robert's done, Robert's been in a position where he started with literally nothing and he built up, but he did it based on the principle that I learned from my teacher, Jim Rohn. Jim Rohn, I asked him, I said, how come my fathers, they're all good men and we're always broke? We had no money for food. And he said, Tony, we're all equal as souls, but we're not equal in the marketplace. I said, what do you mean? He said, Tony, you could be a really good person and work really hard and have nothing. He goes, I brought up school teachers, how little they make and how unfair that is compared to this hedge fund guy. And he goes, Tony, well, let's start with McDonald's. He said, I'm not being derogatory, but it's not designed to be your long-term job. It's an entry job because you don't get paid much because it's easy to learn. Anyone can do that job. So it's not valuable. You're paid in proportion to the value you bring to people. There's not a lot of value. Today, there's machines now starting to replace these people in fast food places. That's why they make so little. But the guy you're saying is terrible, he said, your teachers, how many of them were truly great? I said, well, I had some great teachers. He said, how many? Tell me them. And I listed 3. Right? He said, yes, out of your entire education, there's 3. The others, would you agree? Some were good, some were mediocre, some were terrible. I said, yeah. He goes, and they're helping 20 or 30 students. He goes, so they're paid, and they're not in a position where if they do well, they're paid more because they wanted a guarantee. And they got to guarantee them they do a lousy job. But if you want to put yourself on the line and be valuable, it's a very different game. So he said, the guy you're making fun of or being derogatory towards, most people in those days were getting 6% returns. He goes, he got a 48% return on billions of dollars. Those are people's pension funds. That's their future. That's their economics. So he's worth $1 billion. Because he added that much more valuable. He said, you need to focus on finding a way to do more for others than anybody else in whatever industry you're in. You'll build a brand and you'll become dominant and you'll have a blast because you're a giver, Tony. You're not a taker. You're going to be proud of what you're doing, not just make a lot of money. And that's why I got these, that's actually 114 companies now total. We're doing $7 billion in revenues. And I mean, every single company we built might have that obsession with adding value. And that's what I saw in every one of these people. They didn't just buy the asset or buy it right and then flip it over or cut it up in pieces like private equity used to do 20 years ago. It's much more competitive now. Now it's like, okay, you go to Robert Smith and you got a SaaS organization. He has built a system where you can take any SaaS company and grow it. He knows how to bring the right CEO in the place, what the marketing piece, who are the right people, how can you advance the technology, how can you cut the costs? So he makes it so valuable and then he sells it to a bigger company or takes it public. So every single one of them was obsessed with adding value. And that is really, really unique, but they do it in different ways. So that's what Robert Smith does. You know, if you go to Veritas Capital, Ramsey, he was partners with a guy 12 years ago, and the guy committed suicide. And they had a $2 billion fund. And the fund was, it had a clause in your agreement as a limited partner that if anything happened to the original founder investor, you could take your money back. There were no time limits on anymore. So he literally met with around the world, every investor, flew and met with them one-on-one and said, I want you to stay with us, and here's what I'm going to do. He built that fund from $2 billion to $42 billion in 11 years. His expertise was, he said, I'm going to go do business with the government. The government buys more technology than anyone on earth, and no one else has mastered it. They all avoid it. I'm going to go master it and own them. And again, I can't tell you his returns, but I'll just tell you they're gigantic returns compounded over a decade continuously because he's figured out how to add value in the government system. You know what I mean? If you look at somebody like Khosla, he took one of his best investments, he took $3 million and turned it into $7 billion, right? And how did he do it? He looks around and says, okay, what's a technology that could change the world that will be a necessity? And he saw Juniper Networks. He said, I think that's where the web's going to have to go. He made these bets. And literally, $7 billion is not like a gross number. That's the net return to investors off that investment. So each one of them has vision. Each one of them is massively committed to added value. Each one of them has a system that they built. They don't do it ad hoc to take any company in the categories they focus on and grow it. Another reason I love doing this is I have these guys and they're all in different industries. Some of them in different countries. You go to somebody like MBK Partners, right? And, he's the biggest investor, the most successful private equity investor in basically Japan, China, Asia. He's the richest, South Korean in the world. And it's like, how did he do it? Same thing. He figured out what Asian companies need. He's specialized in that. So I think really knowing your market, really knowing your ideal customer, coming up with products and services that produce raving fans, coming up with an irresistible offer, which is a lot of what they do each time, an offer that is so good that people say, I got to at least try it, and then they over-deliver. They all seem to have that in common, even though they're doing different industries in different ways and have different forms of expertise.
If you want to support our podcast and stay informed about our latest episodes, We're always creating new content every week for our podcast. Subscribing is the best way to ensure that you don't miss out on any of it. Please hit the subscribe button. We really appreciate it. God blesses you all and be legendary, my friends.